Okay, so hello everybody. Thank you very much for your participation and hello, Mr. Professor Bazian. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Um, so before we start listening to the professor, I just would like to give you some information about the Africa and Middle East Foundation as well as East Academy. The Africa Foundation and the Middle East Foundation have been organizing educational programs under two distinct programs, the Middle East Academy and the Africa Academy. And then we have the East Academy, which is the abbreviation of İnsan Siyaset ve Toplum, that is human politics and society. So these two foundations will continue their educational activities under the name of this academy. So far, the Africa Foundation and Middle East Foundation have organized several courses and seminar series, and more than 2,000 students have successfully completed their educations so far, which basically focus on Middle East and Africa. So we have decided to organize this seminar series, which will be consisted of 12 speeches by distinguished speakers on various topics. And we have chosen the right of return at the core of this Palestinian question. So why have we named this seminar series as, a century of struggle for return Palestine refugees? Because we basically believe that at the core of all this Palestinian question indeed lies the struggle to return to their lands. So far, according to the United Nations statistics, Palestinian refugees who have been forced to leave their homes before, during, and after 1948, when the State of Israel was created, and which is named as Nakba in Arabic, translated as catastrophe into English. So we know that almost 80% of Palestinians are right now refugees. So they have been split all around the world, from Latin America to Middle Eastern countries, or from Europe to United States, but also within the Palestinian Authority and within West Bank and within Gaza. So all we witness an unprecedented level of refugee issue. So even today, as Israel continues its genocidal war on Gaza, um, according to the United Nations, again, 1.7 million out of 2.1 million people in Gaza are also refugees who have lost their properties either in 1948 or 1967, or in other wars that Israel has waged. And right now they are becoming refugees again and again, and we don't know yet the impacts of this brutal war on Palestinians living in Gaza. So in this seminar series, we want to dig further into the legal and political and also everyday aspects of this being refugee problem in Palestine. So today we have Professor Hatem Bazian, who will give us a lecture entitled as A Century of Forced Displacement, Land, People, and the Origins of Displacement in Palestine. Mr. Bazian is a co-founder and professor of Islamic law and theology at Zaytuna College, the first accredited Muslim liberal arts college in the US. He also lectures at University of California, Berkeley. And in 2009, he founded the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project at Berkeley Center for Race and Gender. And in 2012, he launched the biannual Islamophobia Studies And he's also columnist for Turkey's Daily Sabah, where I indeed started my journalism career. And he's also the founder of and national chair of American Muslims for Palestine. And also, one very important announcement for our listeners, as Africa Foundation or as East Academia, we are more than happy to announce that Mr. Bazian's book, Palestine, It Is Something Colonial, has been translated into Turkish, entitled as Filistin Bir Sömürgecilik Meselesi. And I think it is published today. So you can check the Twitter account and then look for how to get the book. So these are all the words from me. And Professor, welcome again. Thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Assalamu alaikum, and peace be upon all of you. Jazakumullah khair for the invitation and for taking the time to delve in such an important topic. I think this seminar is very critical, and the work of the foundation is very critical, both in dealing with Africa, which is a very important site from colonial history and legacy, as well as from the contemporary development in the area of the Middle East, which itself is a problematic term, and I will get into that part of it. So to begin and to situate ourselves, maybe I will share a slide. Let's see if this will work. Can you see the slides?
Yes, we can perfectly see it.
Okay, inshallah. Is it moving at your side?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So when we talk about Palestine, we have to speak about the ongoing Nakba. It's not only about the past, but now the construction of Israeli Jewish settlements. And as we are witnessing the genocide in Gaza, there is an ongoing genocide that has been going on in the West Bank as well. It's control over all resources, including, which is one of the big pieces, the gas fields off the coast of Gaza, which both the Europeans as well as Israel and other players want to have their own hands on it. Enacting of laws enabling it, meaning Israel and the settlers, to confiscate Palestinian-owned land. 3,250 kilometers out of 5,800 kilometers in the West Bank have already been confiscated. So when we talk about the level of confiscation, demolition of more than 18,000 houses from 1967 to 2007, and there are another ongoing destruction and demolition of houses. 25% of Palestinians living in Palestine were arrested, so 1 in 4, and now it's actually even in much more higher level. Discriminatory policies against Palestinians living inside Israel and those in the West Bank, which gets us into the apartheid overall. So it's a settler colonialism wrapped under apartheid and wrapped under discriminatory laws. Prevention of refugees and internationally dependent people from return, restitution, compensations, laws and judgments in here that continuously prevent the Palestinians from actually being able to return. Just on a note on Gaza, all the Palestinian population in Gaza, going as far as saying that, are internationally dependent people. They're stateless, and therefore it is the obligation of signatories to all of the international laws, regulations, for Geneva Conventions, so on, to actually protect them, not only to stop and end ceasefire, but actually to protect them and defend them against their literally, as we're watching, genocide. The notion of unrecognized villages in both Israel 48 area and also various parts of the West Bank, which continuously are subject to demolition, removal, and so on. The wall and its associated regime, which creates segregation, cantons in the West Bank, almost 7 disconnected areas. So even when we talk, or people talk about two-state solutions, it's really a dissected two-state solutions, permits, work permits, housing permits, everything that the Palestinians have to do on a daily basis is subject to a permitting process, which ends up in creating layers and layers of control and domination, checkpoints and closure areas and measures, restrictions on movement. At any given day, there's close to maybe 550 checkpoints, but then there is the roving checkpoints where any settlers, any group can actually set up checkpoint, denial of family reunification, arbitrary torture and arrest, demolition of houses, assassination, or extrajudicial killing. Now, all of these features have been in place prior to October 7th. So we're not speaking about, again, because many people, at least at a global level, they only right now, history is pre-October 7th, post-October 7th, so the framing is post-October 7th. All these activities have been taking place for the longest period of time. So just to situate ourselves, Palestine is one of the oldest areas in the world. Actually, olive trees, there is the oldest olive tree in the world is right there in Palestine. They say the oldest olive tree ever found is 8,000 years old. It's in the West Bank. And they say it's oil in ancient Israeli pottery. Israel did not exist at the time of this when this tree was planted. So this is part of this whole discourse about how history gets to be leveraged in a particular way. And the area that predates the history of ancient Israel, which is not the same as the modern nation state that have developed as a result of colonial discourses. Now, how to view Palestine history is very important. History privileges written text. That's why whenever we begin to talk about Palestine, everyone begins to use the biblical narrative as a way to actually engage in Palestine. And the biblical narrative itself, it's been written as an exile text. And even the arrival from the period of post-Moses period to Palestine itself was an external invasion to Palestine, setting aside the religious aspect of the text in general as a part of history. Literary evidence mostly written by victors. So that's part of the issue, whether it's the ancient period or in the 20th century, most of the written record has been literally affected and impacted by the narrative of victors. Now, archaeological evidence is one of those areas that is often completely bypassed. Most of Palestine and the area we are dealing with is one of the most extensively dug up places archaeologically. You could say Palestine, Mesopotamia, Egypt, you could include Turkey and the Anatolian Peninsula. These are areas that are heavily explored archaeologically. Part of it was to try to trace the history and authenticate the history of the Bible, and that impacted archaeological work and research for quite some time. I think post-1970s, we begin to actually see a challenge to the Orientalist construction of archaeology itself. And I think the work and impact of Edward Said's work on archaeology also begins to be present. Most of the archaeological evidence, if not the overwhelming part of it now, actually points to the early Canaanites as the indigenous population in the region that we call today Palestine. And that almost every time you dig up a place, almost a Canaanite monument, wall, irrigation, and so on comes out to it. We also are heavily invested in religious texts. And I think it's very important when we use religious texts not to actually make it to be identical to history on the one hand, identical to political discourses, and to think of it both as a spiritual text that have deep meaning, but history is not the same as politics, and also religious text is not the same as history per se. It gives us overarching wisdom, but it is not to be one-to-one correspondence in that. History of events and leaders is not the same as history of the land and its people. Most history often tends to focus on the leader and the particular events, important as they are in terms of narrating history, but the history in essence is far more complex, far more dynamic, is discursive, and therefore it's very important as we engage in Palestine not to actually reduce it to a series of events and series of leaders, important as that might be. Now, Canaan original recorded inhabitants excavation revealed that a settled community and an agricultural way of life existed at the site of Jericho by 11,000 to 8,000 BC. And I recommend the work of Keith Whiteland in archaeology. He has a great 3 books that are there that we need to actually engage with, because it's not only that we have to speak of the present, but also we have to actually rethink also how the past gets to be narrated. One important aspect of settler colonialism and colonialism in general is that it actually attempts to erase and disfigure the epistemology of societies. Epistemology, in essence, is the way of knowing. And settler colonialism and motherland colonialism, and the British and the French guys, so on, the first element, or one of the fundamental elements, is to demolish indigenous peoples' epistemologies and ways of knowing themselves, their land, their history, their social engagement, and religious worldview. So as such, Palestine has been subject to a demolition of its epistemology, and with it also the epistemology of the Muslim world as a society. And I would say today we have to come to terms that Eurocentric epistemology is the dominant epistemology that everybody engages with. Even as we critique it, we actually take it for granted that epistemology is literally sitting on top of us. And as we're trying to lift this 800-pound gorilla, epistemological gorilla, we're actually often take in part of that epistemology. So that's very important when we speak about Palestine. Now, I want to shift a little bit to speak about Palestine in terms of the history and soap-making industry and the ongoing Nakba. Part of the deconstruction of Palestine was to actually demolish its economy. And that also results in the migration out, results in the exile. It's interesting, I actually visited Chile, and large Palestinian population in there, which began to actually migrate initially during the late part of the 19th century, but accelerated during the early part of the 20th century during the British colonization and mandate over Palestine. part of this is that the British used to actually send out Palestinians out to exile or the destruction of their economy. And Palestine, in particular, the city of Nablus in the West Bank, was the hub, economic hub, for Palestine, and the soap factories were so critical to this engagement. So when we think about Palestinian refugees and the right of return, we often think, let's say, of the war resulting in refugees, but not think of all the different aspects that results in pushing people out, economic colonization, social colonization, actual war and pushing out. And we have a large number of Palestinians that get sent to exile during the 1936-39 revolt that takes place. So that's just to think of the economic aspect. Olive trees and war on Palestinian trees. This is actually right now is almost dated, but close to 800,000 trees have been uprooted, and that continues to be increased. 33 times the number of trees in Central Park in New York. When people come to Central Park, they think how magnificent the park is. But to think of Palestine, and in particular the West Bank, where olive trees and agriculture are so intertwined into the culture and the society in such a way that this war on the trees and war on Palestinian livelihood has been going on, and both for building the apartheid wall, but also as a form of collective punishment. I could not find actually in any historical period where an occupation, a colonial project actually uses trees and cutting of the trees as a form of collective punishment. What is interesting in here is that the environmental movement, which is predominantly white liberal movement in Europe and in the United States, Canada, Australia, and so on, have been utterly silent on actually addressing the environmental destruction that have been visited upon Palestine throughout the 20th century all the way up to the present. So it's olive trees, a symbol of Palestinian society and history. Not only that, but you have the Sierra Club here in the United States, and also I think has operation in Canada. They actually have what you call tours and visits to Israel, where they take some of these environmental, quote, conscious people to see the environmental miracle that Israel have actually achieved in terms of its environmental work and research. And they will go there, tour, they'll go to kibbutz, they'll go up to possibly the north, they'll go to see some what you call drip irrigation, which I say drip colonization that takes place. They'll see at all this and come back without actually talking, visiting, engaging anything relative to the destruction that have been visited on Palestine for the 20th century. So much so that almost now the Dead Sea has become almost more dead than it is. Almost half of its water has been completely decimated, which results in also migration out. Now, when you speak on Palestine, you actually get to be often confronted with the reality of being silent here in the West. The House ousted Ilhan Omar from its Foreign Affairs panel over past comments on Israel, settling a score from when Democrats held the majority. So the effect, again, even somebody like Ilhan Omar as a congresswoman were removed from the Foreign Affairs Committee because she critiques Israel and critiques its policies directed at the Palestinians. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu promises to start annexing the West Bank, right? So and this is actually it began as a policy statement from the Likud party, and now it's the effective policy of the state. The Jewish people have an exclusive and unquestionable rights to all areas of the land of Israel. The policy statement reads, develop Area C of the occupied West Bank and preserving and developing a united Jerusalem. As we speak today in the United States election for the presidential election, Trump already have promised Miriam Adelson that if he gets elected, that he will actually carry forth the annexation of the West Bank. Just to remind you, when he got elected in 2016, he promised before the election to Sheldon Adelson, Miriam's husband at the time, and also herself, based on their donations, that he will move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. He will recognize the annexation of the Golan Heights, and also will normalize or give recognition that the settlements in the West Bank are not illegal in this from the United States perspective. And as such, and also closing the Palestine representation office in Washington, D.C. So those promises in 2016 that he promised to Sheldon Adelson because of his donation have been fulfilled. And now Trump is promising to recognize the annexation of the West Bank. This is what Miriam Adelson is demanding or wanting for her political contribution to Trump. And also, Trump is promising to expel and to deport pro-Palestine activists in the United States. So this is, as we speak, this notions of allowing and permitting the annexation of the West Bank, and with it, as we witness, the continuation of the Nakba taking place. So the coalition agreement, the nation of Israel has a natural right to the land of Israel. So that's, again, the formulation that's been adopted. And sovereignty in all of historical Palestine is to be recognized as the right of the Jewish people. So in here, even as we speak earlier on, the notion of a refuge, that was the initial discussion about Palestine as a refuge, and now it's actually becoming into a natural right. So this means further Palestinian refugees and expulsion of Palestinians from Palestine. Also, the Israeli Knesset Committee agrees to fast-track bill to revoke citizenship of Palestinian prisoners. So this is, again, you begin with so-called Palestinians who are unacceptable to the Israeli society in order to legitimize the notion of taking citizenship. And we could set aside the fact that citizenship is a fourth class citizenship, but just the notion that Israel often speaks to the Western world as democracy and that Arabs have rights and so on, we are seeing the apartheid structure and differentiated type of citizenship in place. Also here, in terms of separation with solid Jewish majority, is what J Street, which is seen to be progressive. And then the notion of proportional response, that the concept of proportionality really must cease to exist. So 1,000 Palestinian mothers will cry. So as we're witnessing in Gaza, all these statements predate October 7th, right? So again, when people are speaking about what is taking place, literally we are dealing with a genocide that has been unfolding on the Palestinians, causing continued Nakba on a scale that has not been seen before. U.S. indifference is there. I no longer listen to the United States, what you call condemn, concern, right? You could see whenever an Israeli is injured or anything happens, in the strongest terms, they call who's the perpetrator and so on. It's almost like we're deeply concerned, as if they are looking for sympathy, that they're actually concerned rather than actually the policy that makes this possible. Now, Israel and Palestine, mapping Israeli occupation. According to Human Rights Watch, Israel, which calls itself a Jewish, is committing crimes against humanity, apartheid, and persecution against the Palestinians. Again, this was the Human Rights Watch actually speaking of the circumstances that are present in Palestine. So if we think about where we were or where we are right now, we're talking about equal population. Jewish Israelis, 6.8 million, Palestinians, 6.8 million in historical Palestine. And I would say that the population right now is still within that same range. If we notice when Blinken first visit, when the war on Gaza started, his first visit was actually to negotiate the removal of Palestinians from Gaza. That was actually the negotiations or what he came with. And there was an understanding by Blinken that Egypt and Jordan will take the bulk of the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. And that agreement was actually being fast-tracked. And if you remember, Biden flew to the region in order to cement this agreement. What made the agreement collapse is the attack on the hospital, Al-Ma'madani hospital, that killed at the time 800, that scuttled this plan. And the plan was for helping and paying the debt or some of the debt of Egypt, as well as helping and financing some of the debt of Jordan. And in return, that they will take the Palestinians in Gaza. There were already discussions about maybe a strip of land in the Sinai desert where the Palestinians will be there. So in general, Israel from its inception has the problem, and I'm not speaking that Israel defines the problem, but from the Zionist perspective, Israel has the problem that Palestine was fully inhabited and heavily populated. Herzl and the Zionists actually sent a delegation to Palestine and a fact-finding mission, and they returned with a report. And the report, in essence, is one of the analogies that they said is that the bride is beautiful, but it's already betrothed, meaning that Palestine is a beautiful land, and it is already heavily populated and claimed by the population that is there. Now, this gets us into, from that point on, or at least early on, the discussions about what to do with the Palestinian population that is there. Now, Herzl planned from the get-go in his writings and memoirs is the concept of transfer, and literally says to spirit the penniless population across the borders or across the boundaries. That element or that aspect of transfer is foundational to Zionist ideas, theories, and also ideas of colonization. So I said one of the aspects of colonization is epistemology, very important. As far as settler colonialism and colonialism, they have a difference between them. Colonialism in terms of motherland and satellite colonies always need the workforce or the labor force of the colonized population. So if you think of, let's say, Britain, needed the labor force in India, needed the labor force in Africa, needed the labor force in even in the colonies, whether Australia, New Zealand, and so on. Sometimes they engage in repression, causing famine and death and so on, but they needed the labor force. And also they shifted population from one side of the colonies to the other. So for example, they brought Indian labor force to various parts of Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, even in parts of Sudan, as a way to facilitate the bureaucratic infrastructure that the British had in their colonies. Even if we think about South Africa, many of us would think of Gandhi and is celebrated as a figure for India's liberation and end of British colonial discourse in India. But in South Africa, he's seen as a functioneer of the British colonization. Because when he was brought to South Africa, he was a colonial bureaucrat working within the British colonial infrastructure. So very, very important. When we speak about World War I, and this is the painful part for the Muslims, is that the British and the French armies had large number of Muslim soldiers recruited from the colonies. And this became one of the most, at least in World War I, as we deal with the history of the late Ottoman history, right? Literally the need or the British pressing for what came to be known erroneously as the Great Arab Revolt during the World War I, which we say it was not great, nor was it Arab. It was a British intelligence operation pushed forth, or at least thought by T.E. Lawrence, that in the West and in Hollywood, they call him Lawrence of Arabia. I say he's Lawrence of 10 Downing Street, a British intelligence officer that fomented revolt against the Ottomans in the Hijaz and then into Jordan, that cemented the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Even as the so-called revolt being fomented, the British and the French were meeting to basically enjoy a meal and divvying up the Ottoman territories, while the revolt was taking place to disrupt the Ottoman supply routes in order to allow for British troops, in particular from Egypt and the Mediterranean, to land without losing troops. But the key aspect in here is that thousands of Muslim troops were both in the British and the French armies. And that's normative in colonial history or colonial discourses. What my point is that settler colonialism, in distinction to motherland satellite colonialism, engages in genocide and transfer. Genocide for the indigenous population, and for the remaining populations, they engage in transfer. The best example you could actually set aside Palestine, the United States. The indigenous population in the United States was reduced to genocide, and the remaining population of indigenous Native Americans were actually pushed into reservations. So far today, we have still till today in the United States what's called the reservations taken place. And therefore, it is the same in Australia, the same in New Zealand, the same in Canada. And I would say Palestine is a settler colonial project by Zionism. And from early on, a slow unfolding genocide that is built upon the concept of transfer or to empty out. So literally the notion of Zionism, a land without a people, for a people without a land. But if the land had people in it, then the people have to be transferred out in order for this project to come about. This gets into the idea that Palestine was not, or the Nakba was not started or did not start on 1948. Palestinian Nakba begins in 1917. right? And you could maybe date it a little bit earlier, a couple of days to World War One, the beginning of World War One. But Palestine as a Nakba begins in 1917, where the British became the colonial power. The British issued the Balfour Declaration on November 2nd, 1917. The British do not take control of Palestine until December 11th, 1917. So basically, the Balfour Declaration as a legal document is foundational legal documents is that the possession of the territory and having sovereignty over territory gives the ability of the sovereign to articulate their policy or dispossession of whatever territory they have. The British actually promised something that they did not have actually possession or control of, because November 2nd versus the actual occupation occurs December 11th. And furthermore, the actual British role in Palestine does not get cemented until the Paris conference, post-World War I conference, and then gets to literally gets the legal stamp with the mandate of the League of Nations, 1922, 1923. So we have a period of time of almost 5 years that Palestine was colonized by the British, but eventually gets to be shaped around the Balfour Declaration that gets to be incorporated into the Paris Conference, gets to be incorporated into the League of Nations. And from that point on, the British incubate a settler colonial project. In incubating the settler colonial project, the British understood early on that the Jewish population, the Jewish Zionist population in Palestine was very small and minuscule. And distinguishing it here between Jewish Palestinians versus Zionist settler colonial arrivals that were trying to construct this settler colonial project in partnership with the British. Right? So in here, it was minuscule, and the British became, in essence, the incubator for the Zionist project. Now, the British themselves had their own interest, and it's very important because it's still relevant as we speak today. Maybe it's not the British today as the leading interest, but to understand, the British were actually thinking from purely colonial terms in the following. The British were the colonial power of India. India was colonized in the beginning of the 17th century, and for a number of almost 100 plus years was under the direct governing of the East India Company. So this notion today, when we think about companies ruling over states, the East India Company was ruling over India. And India was the mother lode of colonial resources. When the British entered India, India was 24% of the global GDP. When the British left India, they reduced India to 3% of the global GDP. They took out of India $45 trillion worth of wealth, 17 times the scale of the British economy today. Right? But from the British perspective, is how to actually get the raw material from India all the way to the island that's called Great Britain, right? So anytime that you actually are looting and pillaging, not that I am an expert in looting and pillaging, but for those who engage in looting and pillaging, they have to take what they looted and what they pillaged from the place of where they took it to take it back home, so it'll be displayed at the British Museum later on. So in general, the idea is how to transfer this loot, and the only way to transfer it is through the sea, through shipping. And in order to do that, you have to pass through the Red Sea. And therefore, the British colonized Yemen. The port of Aden, during the period of colonial control, became the most busy, or one of the busiest ports for the British, because everything that was being taken out of India and also other parts of Asia, including later on China and so on, was passing through the Red Sea and the port of Aden there at the mouth. That also gets us into the British plan later on to colonize Egypt and also colonize Sudan. So all of this was motivated by movement of products and raw material and resources, and in return, having finished products developed in the British industrial base. Again, the Industrial Revolution resulted in increased production, and increased production requires to find markets for that increased production, because the British market itself is very small. And therefore, not only that you are bringing raw material, you provide the raw material to these factories that increases employment, increases the living wages and standard of living, but it's all contingent on also finding markets for the finished project in the colonies, and thus disrupting the colonial economy, the colonies' economies, in order to maintain this flow of raw material finished products. Now, the interesting part, just on a side note, Adam Smith, a major book, The Wealth of Nations, was a critique of the colonial economy, mercantilism, which each of the colonial powers in Europe, he was not speaking about the global South, the Europe, that we are competing, we're not competing with one another. Every colonial power is having a closed economy in the colonies. Actually, if we open up and we have what you call a free market, laissez-faire, among the European in their colonial economies, actually will result in greater level of economic activity and prosperity. So his critique of mercantilism that resulted in the adoption of laissez-faire, that is the foundation of currently capitalism and global market economy, have to be understood, because many of us who are in the global South read Adam Smith and we think that he is speaking in universalist terms, rather than he was speaking in particular solutions to the particular problems as a result of colonization. I'm digressing a little bit in here, but the British were thinking about colonial trade and movement of products. Palestine, especially with the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, becomes a critical component of how to protect the Suez Canal and the passage of resources into the Mediterranean and into Europe. The British were thinking that Napoleon have attacked Egypt, tried to disrupt our colonial trade. They were worried that the Ottoman actually will come back from the north and reclaim the Egypt, even though at the time that Muhammad Ali and his descendants were just giving nominal allegiance. They were worried that the Ottomans will come back and dominate the area. So how to create this aspect? They also were worried about possible Russian, right, Tsarist Russia. So the British were thinking from colonial terms and also engaging in their deeply anti-Semitic worldview. Anti-Semitism in Europe continues to be at the high level, and the Europeans had two what you call problems, racist problems, just to be sure. The one was the Jewish question, a racist problem that they have, and the second was the Eastern question, right, which is Islamophobia. Right? So anti-Semitism, foundational to European thought. Again, it's not even in the, I don't know why these balloons continue to go up on but anyway, so the Jewish question, deep anti-Semitism, not only in the modern period, but actually European, and I'm using Europe in here in its definition, as because the notion of Europe was also gets to be invented as a modern concept. But deeply embedded in it is this anti-Semitism. Going back to the Crusades period, the Crusades, every time that the Crusaders left or went out, there was a massive pogroms against Jewish population as they moved down to arrive at Palestine and into the area of the Mediterranean. During the Spanish Inquisition, it also affected Muslims and Jews in there. So the history of Europe is, in terms of its anti-Semitism, is endemic and continues to be so today, with the rise of the neo-Nazis, as we witness, and then Islamophobia, and it had different iteration in the during the period of 1400s onward. The identity or the image of the Turk was how the anti-Muslim or Islamophobia was crystallized. So you could actually see this in terms. So the British were deeply anti-Semitic and wanted to strike two camels with one stone by creating a buffer state to protect the Suez Canal, and also to ease the presence of Eastern Jewish migration into England at the time during the late 1800s by actually providing them a place in Palestine, and thus they always will be beholden to the British in that way. So the British were thinking purely strategic and racist, and they continue to be in that form. Now they're shifting a little bit more to target the Muslim population. So you could say they never learned anything. They always have had, Europe have always had a problem with living with the other, right? There's always been, whether it's throwing out or pogroms, that's been the history of Europe. And I know they often come around to try to give us some lessons in human rights and so on. But the reality, again, is Europe has been incapable, right, of living with the other on equal epistemological terms and having as equal co-production of society in that way. So that's what the British engage in relations to thinking of Palestine, issuing the Balfour Declaration in those terms. It is how to actually create a buffer state and how to secure the Suez Canal, because it is the key pipeline. And today the Suez Canal accounts to 14 to 16% of global trade, which gets us into, even in the current circumstances, why the closure, or at least the disruption of the trade in the Red Sea actually is still one of the most fundamental pillars of global trade. Most of products are shipped through the sea and then on land through trains. Airplanes can't carry much of anything from the global trade. It's actually the amount of shipping that takes place by sea is overwhelming, whether it's in terms of energy or all the products that you consume. So that's why in strategic thinking, the British were thinking in those terms. So from 1917 onward, the incubation of a settler colonial project. And in order to incubate a settler colonial project, there has to be setting up a military infrastructure for the settler colony that is to be erased, and thus empowering Jewish Zionist settlers, allowing them from early on with the Jewish Legion that was part of the British Army during World War I, it actually to be placed and positioned in Palestine, and that constitute the nucleus for the later on the emergence of the Israeli army, as well as the various Jewish Zionist terrorist organizations that had this part of this connection. Second, empowering economically the newly arriving settlers by means of extending loans, facilitating major economic projects, giving them the right to purchase as well as take public land, because this was land that actually was subject to disposition of the British. And in this, they use some of the early formation of Islamic law in relations to public land and so on. So that was allowing them, also giving them equal standing in Palestinian social, political, cultural affairs. The British actually, often you see people putting out the Palestinian currency, where it has Palestine on it, Palestine from 1927. That's a very problematic, because that currency is not the Palestinian currency. That was the British issued currency of 1927, once they set up the political structure to rule over Palestine as mandate. Prior to that, the Palestinian used the Turkish lira, or the Turkish currency, up to the World War I period, up to 1919. Then the British pound was actually being used in circulation, and the British constituted the monetary policy in Palestine, and imposing the inclusion of Hebrew on the Palestinian currency, with the notion of reference to Iraq's Israel being imprinted within the currency. So when people say, here's name Palestine is mentioned, that you're actually, this is a very problematic construct, because again, we're talking about epistemology. It is the political epistemology of the British that created the currency, that while giving a nod to the existence of Palestine, because that's what the mandate, but it's actually created equal standing to the Zionist settlers, who at the time are less than, literally in terms of the Zionist settlers versus the Jewish Palestinians, less than 2% of the population, if at most at that point. And then in addition to this, facilitating the diplomatic and political recognition of the World Zionist movement as an arbiter and a participant in discussing and relating to the circumstances in Palestine. So what I want for us to date, the dispossession of the Palestinians, the refugee problem, the right of return from 1917, and then you have different periodization of mass expulsion. Mass expulsion in 1929, or as a result of the protest movement around the Hatem Bazian. The people, you refer to it as the Wailing Wall. The actual reference to this is Hatem Bazian. That's what the Palestinians, and it was in the middle of the Moroccan quarter. So there was protest in 1929. You have another mass protest movement, 1936 to 39. It results in expulsion, removal, exiles of Palestinians. Then you get to the biggest, up to this point, the 1948 Nakba, which begins late 1947 in November 1947, and culminate up to 1949. And during that period, mass expulsion of the Palestinians, close to 780,000 Palestinians are expelled, ethnically cleansed, 12 urban centers completely emptied, some 561 villages completely emptied, erased of the population. And when we speak about Palestinians right now, Palestinians live in different circumstances. You have refugees in Gaza. 85% of all the Palestinians in Gaza are refugees from 48. You have refugees also inside Israel itself, because these are called the absent, present, absentee, because there were different parts of the state. Then you have refugees in 67 area as a result of 48, but also as a result of 67, refugees in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Egypt, and across the diaspora. So when we speak about the Palestine and the centrality of Palestine in the discourses on the right of return, we're speaking about a settler colonial project that is intending on emptying Palestine of its population, and one cannot begin to discuss Palestine without the right of return as a foundational element to our discussion. I know I went a little bit further, but I'm more than happy to take any and all your questions.
Okay. Thank you very much. This was very informative, very helpful. So you have extensively covered everything, and so we can, I think, go to the Q&A session. Just straight, and then okay. So we have a question from Mesut Özcan. So
Sure.
he says. Um, there were several waves of migration to Israel to continue their aim of increasing Jewish population in Palestine. Currently, which part or parts of the world is the source of Jewish migration? He asks.
Well, there's ebbs and flows in terms of Jewish migration, but literally as of this year, there's a migration out taking place. The Israeli press have pointed that close to 1 million Israelis have left Palestine as we speak. Over the past maybe 10 to 15 years, interestingly enough, there has been large migration from Western countries, whether it's from the United States, some parts of also Europe, of migration into Israel. In the late 70s, 80s to early 90s, the Russian and Eastern European were the largest segment that came in, and then also the bringing of the Ethiopian Jews in terms of population. So it depends on the developments of the circumstances that takes place in different parts of the world. And I think right now is actually what we're having is almost a reverse of the migration as a result of the development. Even prior to the current, there was actually a steady outflow. I think there is an increased migration from Israel to Portugal, to Cyprus, to Greece, even out back to the United States. So right now it's almost on the reverse, while accounting for the most recent period prior to this, where the population came from.
Okay, thank you. So our second question is from Fatma Zehra Zorlu. She says there have been displacements for a century, but since October 7, they have been bombing, killing, wounding thousands of people and displacing hundreds of thousands of people. So she refers to the map that you have shown and asks, what kind of change is there in the 1/1 ratio of 6.8 Israel to 6.8 Palestine indicated on the map? So I mean, she basically wants to understand after all this displacement, so what was the latest situation of this map?
Well, if I take the reporting from Israel in terms of the net outflow from Israel out and speak about the Palestinian population, I would say now there are far more maybe Palestinians as a correspondence, despite the death and destruction that have been visited on Gaza. And this is just not to downplay what is taking place. But if you have 1 million that have left, and that might be also followed by another segment that would leave as a result of the economic difficulty, the political difficulty, the security difficulty. So I would say that we are right now in an influx in terms of population numbers and how the population numbers actually would arrive. Now I'm going to take this a little bit further to say the following. All colonial projects gets to be preoccupied with demographic numbers and population figures and so on, because deeply down, every colonial project is a racially constructed project. It classifies and engages in classification. So the notion that we're speaking about Jewish versus Arab, that's a classification that is a colonial classification in terms of how it's actually being shaped, privileges the Zionist Jewish population, and attempts to problematize and demographically design the suppression, transfer, and so on. we need, on the one hand, to understand the dynamics, but also to reject it as a form of looking and examining Palestine history and its context. So even though I put that on the map, it's part of our challenge is, again, I said earlier, is how to critique the 800-pound gorilla while not actually falling in its epistemology. So we do not accept the notion that demographics is the way that we shape our understanding. Maybe just to speak about Muslim history have always been multi-faith, multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multi-linguistic. And if you think about the genius of Muslim civilization, it actually made it possible for co-participation and co-production of Islamic civilization without centering ethnic differences or racial difference, tribal differences. That's the project of what I consider to be European constructed modernity and nationalism, that its foundation is difference, is the form or the only way for membership. And I think what we need is both to challenge this and to actually center our own epistemology, that difference is to be welcomed and celebrated. And I'm deeply faithful person says that it is from the sign of your Lord, right? That the diversity of your faces and your tongues, and also خلقناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا, that we created from a nation and tribe so that you may know one another. And inna akramakum indallahi atqakum, that those who are most honored in the sight of your Lord are the ones who have deep God consciousness. Right? So even how we translate taqwa, sometimes we translate it wrongly as fear of God, is actually taqwa is to have God consciousness in your engagement. So we need to change, we need to challenge as well as put forth a different conceptualization of ourselves and our societies.
Okay, thank you. And our next question comes from Mr. Shamsuddin Tabur. He says, "Thank you, Dr. Bazian, for your insightful talk. You have provided us with a compelling argument for understanding the Palestinian-Israeli interaction through the lens of colonialism. You also emphasize that epistemic decolonization is a crucial and urgent task, not just for Palestinians, but for everyone in order to break free from the dominant Zionist discourse. Clearly, your recent book contributes to the complex, multifaceted process what Ngugi wa Thiong'o referred to, I don't know how to read this, but as decolonizing the mind. In your view, what other processes and areas should be involved in the decolonization of the Palestinian question? For instance, I am particularly interested in hearing about decolonization of university curricula. Could you please comment on the current status of decolonizing knowledge production when it comes to the Palestine question, especially within the context of the American universities?
Yeah, well, many of us at least engage in the project of decolonizing the university and decolonizing curriculum. We have to take it as a point of departure that global educational infrastructure is rooted in Eurocentricity. And this is without exception, maybe just few hamlets here and there, even in areas of research that should not be Eurocentric, we actually quote mostly the Eurocentric sources. Even like sometimes in Hadith authentication, we actually quote Western sources as they have a standing in Hadith literature overall, right? So one is we have to identify that we are living in a Eurocentric world that dominates every aspect of knowledge and engagement in knowledge. It defines the human, it defines philosophy, it defines politics, it defines economy, it defines social patterns of engagement, it defines what religion is and how to engage it. So almost every aspect in there. Knowing this is how to begin to first articulate your own or our own collective epistemology. When I say about our own, I'm speaking of the global South. I'm speaking about what are the epistemology of some of our brothers and sisters in various parts of Africa, in the Congo, in Tanzania, in Senegal, in Nigeria, in Sudan, in Ethiopia, right, in South Africa, as well as the different epistemologies that gets to be articulated in Asia, Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese, Koreans, Thai, all this engage, because that's part of the world that we need to also be cognizant. Then Latin America or South America and so on. So far, I think some of the questions that have been articulated in terms of epistemological challenge has come down actually from Latin America. Some of the scholars in there actually have been contemplating, maybe because their close proximity to the United States resulted in asking deep questions and what. So understanding and defining our epistemology is foremost, which would be the first cause of, or the first element in terms of what is the basis of your epistemology? What's your worldview that is constructed about it? How do you go about solving the challenges and the problems that you face epistemologically, and engage in conversations with people who face similar circumstances of erasure, disfiguring them, and then begin to construct an educational project program that is actually built upon the epistemology that you have, in order for us to begin to actually understand ourselves. Like, who are we? For a long period of time, we're still trying to say we want to imitate the Western Eurocentric paradigm in order for us to have a meaning. And this, maybe we'll go back to Ibn Khaldun, that it is the endemic nature of people who are defeated or reach into a position of inferiority, that they want to imitate the cause of their defeat, thinking in that imitation their salvation. But what ends up is actually furthering and empowering the cause of their defeat or their domination. So we need to actually begin to think in ways to bypass, to deprogram ourselves in order to get to that point where we have a curriculum that reflects our constructed epistemology. I think Stephen Biko said it the best: the most dangerous weapons in the hand of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed, because we begin to shape our own ideas based on the requirements, the diktat, the conceptualization of the colonial power. And that's where we are. So that's the type of work that needs to be done.
Okay, thank you very much. So indeed, we have like 10 to 15 minutes left, but we still have a few questions. So
Sure.
maybe we can proceed with shorter answers,
Yes.
just to stick to the time. Another question from Hatem Basri: given the continued presence of over 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, even under these genocidal conditions, what strategic outcomes might Israel achieve if the immediate removal of the Palestinian population is not happening? Is Israel stuck in this colonial project of forced displacement? What do you think?
Well, I think Israel has no strategic path forward. It is unable to extricate itself from the strategic disaster that is unfolding in itself. Clausewitz said that war is politics by other means. And the question for Israel is, what is the politics that it's trying to achieve? If it is the expulsion of 2.5 million Palestinians, assuming that it wants to do so, okay, and it wants to carry it out, as evidence in front of our eyes, it's not tenable. And even if it is tenable, let's say they remove the Palestinians to Egypt and Jordan, this would result in greater destabilization in the region rather than stabilization. So from that strategic perspective, it's a total failure, no matter what the outcome is. If you get them out to Egypt or to Jordan, assuming that this is what Ben Gavir, Smotrich, and Netanyahu, with support of the United States. More importantly, that Israel's standing globally has completely been demolished or completely collapsed. Politics in general requires for you to seek friends, allies, and a presentation of who you are globally, not only in terms of Washington and what you call Paris and London. You need far more level of acceptance for you to be, in essence, a continuation. The standing of Israel today has totally collapsed, and I don't think it's reversible. So from that perspective, also that cannot be achieved in relations to Israel thinking. So what we are at this point is in a protracted stalemate, and it depends what will other actors in regionally and globally are ready to take the next steps in order to see a change of the strategic political map that we are looking at. And I think right now we are looking at a protracted stalemate, but at the end of it, that strategically speaking, Israel have lost considerably in its strategic positioning. As the argument, blood is not an argument. So killing more Palestinians is not an argument to actually conduct politics, no matter what Israel, the right wing, Ben Gavir, and even their supporters in the United States continues to do.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Ruwaida Abazi. Salams, Professor. Thank you very much for your contribution. You truly are inspirational. How can we internalize the term of Islamophobia within our own epistemology without the mentality of allowing ourselves be victimized, thus feel as the weak ones? That's probably
we did internalize Islamophobia for sure, right? Well, again, going back to the early formation, 17th century, 18th century, that Muslims are backward, Islam is in decline, you need to change yourself because your tradition and so on is not fit to this period and so on. So we ended up becoming what you call having an internal Eurocentric person sitting in our mind, dictating and asking us to go. If they go left, we go left, go right, go up, go backward. If it rains in New York, we carry an umbrella. If it snows in Russia, we get a jacket on, no matter what the circumstances we face. So in this sense, we have to take an account. Part of it is that we have to go through an intellectual as well as comprehensive, in essence, deprogramming, if that's the term. Interesting that the Prophet ﷺ, when he used to go to Ghar Hira to meditate, he used to empty out. What are the things that we need to? I think we need to empty out the Eurocentric that is sitting in our mind, to empty out from our mind the superiority that we are projecting on the Western world and history over the past 300 to 400 years, that we can't fix anything except if it's a blonde hair, blue-eyed person comes and tell us how to do it. All these are the things that we need to actually reconfigure. I do think we need to reconfigure our economy. The economic landscape globally is not actually functioning. Even in the Western world is not functioning. You go around the streets, the homeless people that are there, people are just living from paycheck to paycheck. The addiction that is taking place, motivated by corporate greed and interest in the pharmaceutical industry, both the legal and illegal part of it. So we have to actually examine those notions in ourselves, empty out, in order for us to reconfigure and reassert a different worldview. I do think a different worldview is possible. A decolonial worldview is possible. I think we have considerable, if not overwhelming, epistemological content to affect and influence various rounds. I've been interested in the whole notions of awqaf, the whole notions of building an economy based on contentment, tijaratan an taradin in the Quran. How do we build that where we actually are building each other rather than eliminating each other in economic competition, which is the basis of capitalist structured economy? How for us to actually manifest those as values as we engage in the world today. So I think part of it is that we have internalized our incapacity. In psychology, we say we have arrived at learned helplessness. That's a very devastating, because you don't even have to start, because you already have determined that you are helpless. So we have to reverse that completely in order for us to actually reshape the world that we want to be living in and build.
Okay, thank you. Next question comes from Elif Aydın. She says, is it possible to talk about a Palestinian diaspora? If there is such a Palestinian diaspora, what about its lobbying activities, or, what is it doing to prevent the ongoing genocide?
Well, there is a Palestinian diaspora. We have a strong presence. I chair and founded the American Muslims for Palestine. Literally tomorrow I'll be heading to Chicago. We're having massive protests, massive mobilization. We're expecting about 100,000 people, but it's both votes and resources, and that's the tug of war. AIPAC have already spent $100 million just to defeat a number of pro-Palestine political figures. So that's a tug of challenge for us, but we're engaged. I think our efforts in Michigan have showed itself that we have effective organizing in Georgia, Minnesota, parts of New York, parts of New Jersey. So there are, I would say, areas of effect and impact. We saw this outcome in the UK election, where 5 of the pro-Palestine candidates ran independent on Gaza, on Palestine, and one which actually challenged even the winning Labour Party. So those are pockets of impact. And I would say the fact that you have a massive pro-Palestine mobilization across the Western world is directly connected to the fact that Palestinian diaspora are engaged and are making an impact. It's not an equal footing, but I'm very optimistic that it's heading in the right direction.
Okay, thank you. And another question comes from Sema Karame. She thanks you and asks what you think of the conceptualization of Palestinian question. To what extent is it considered as part of colonial epistemology?
It's found there, even almost from the get-go. That's what the title of my book, Palestine, it is something colonial. That was the letter from Herzl to Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes was the Minister of Colonies. Cecil Rhodes was so endowed with himself that he named the whole country Rhodesia on his behalf. And he was the one who designed the British colonial project on the eastern part of Africa, from South Africa all the way to Egypt, and wanted to have a full road to connect South Africa to Egypt. So Herzl wrote a letter to him asking for Palestine. Say, why do I turn such a matter out of the way for you? Because it's something colonial. And all of the early Zionists, Jabotinsky, Weizmann, Joseph Weitz, all of them spoke of a colonial project, and they had no compulsion or no apology. Post-construction of the state, post-48, post what you call the cleaning up of the image of the state, they used all kinds of PR propaganda in order to transform a colonial project into a return to a homeland, right? So again, it's the point of analysis and point of critique is Palestine is the last settler colonial project to be commissioned in the 20th century. And I do believe that settler colonialism is the way to evaluate and examine Palestine as a project that has unfolded with the sponsorship of the Western world.
Okay, thank you. And another question from Abid Ihsan. He says the Zionists often reference the biblical promise of the Holy Land as justification for the historical and contemporary claims, the Ardi Maw'ud issue.
Yeah.
Given that this assertion is grounded in religious belief, how can it be effectively challenged within this forced displacement framework?
Yeah, well, this framework actually originates from Christian Zionism, which predates Jewish Zionism. I actually have a book in here about Columbus, all right? Right, so Columbus and the quest for Jerusalem. So Columbus' journey to the New World, or what came to be the New World, was in essence seeking an alternative route to actually capture Jerusalem after the end of the Crusades. So the Crusades failed in going east, and therefore he actually appealed to the Spanish and the Portuguese, as well as the Pope, to fund an expedition to the west to find an alternative route to India, and from India come and capture Jerusalem from its eastern direction. So that was the motivation for the Columbus trip in that way. So understanding that colonialism was foundational almost to every aspect of their notions and their understanding, and colonialism is wedded into Christian theology, right? And part of the Christian Zionism is there's aspect of irredentism, that they have a problem philosophically of why did this whole region abandon Christianity from their perspective and convert it to Islam, and therefore it has to be brought back because Muslims are the false religion. That's how they often articulate, and right, they've been duped by Satan, right? And as part of the second coming of Jesus, there has to be a reconstituting of Israel in Palestine, because it's the stepping stone to the second coming. So that's the Christian theology. Now, in here, beginning in the 19th century, this notion gave the dispensationalist theology, where not only that you wait for God to manifest these events, you actually need to force almost God's hand by actually accelerating. The British, when they arrived in Palestine, they defined their victory in Palestine in Crusaders' terms. They said, now the Crusades comes to an end after 672 years of Muslim control of the Holy Land. That's how they actually, the headlines in the newspapers and so on. So the notion of writing back is interpreted after the fact, meaning that how to interpret the constituting of the state, that's a propaganda, what I consider a constructing rationale in order to continue to get the support both in the Western world and also convince internal Zionists, a Jewish population, that this is a legitimate project, even though that it is a colonial project in the get-go. What we need is to challenge Christian Zionism, to challenge also Zionism, that Jewish Zionism that adopted Christian Zionism and Christian theology to legitimize settler colonialism. And I would add also today, we also need to challenge Muslim Zionists who likewise articulate these notions in order to legitimize what's the Abraham Accords, the normalization, by using religious texts in the same way. So it's actually almost, we have a similar type of pattern that existing where we are all living Christian theology that is actually mandating foreign policy and engagement in the world. And that's, I think, one of the biggest takeaway is for us to examine this notion. Even Jewish, Muslim, we are almost a supporting actors on the play of Western theological, colonial, Christian theology, foreign policy, Eurocentricity, and our role is to come, serve tea, and exit stage left for the history, the only history, right, exceptional history of Western thought, Eurocentricity, Western imperial Christianity, to distinguish it from, I would say, liberation theology within Christianity. And that's what we need to critique and be able to do so while not also engage in bombastic way to frame our relationship with different religious traditions. It's a very, very tall order, but that's, I think, what we need to do to critique it and not to accept the framing that they actually engage with to legitimize it.
Okay, thank you very much. So
You're welcome.
we have come to the end of our first seminar in this series, and it's been very insightful, very fruitful. We have learned a lot, and indeed, I mean, more than learning, you have, you know, you have provided us with an intellectual journey, which we can indeed use for, how to approach to the Palestinian question. So, I mean, so it's been really helpful to understand the nature, of this issue, not only the historical side, but also its epistemological side of the problem. So thank you very much. And
Thank you.
so we hope to see you again in another seminar. So thanks,
Inshallah.
inshallah. Thank you for your
Tashakkur.
time. Okay. Rica ederiz.